Ashworth Hall, September 1812. The household had been in preparation since Thursday, which meant it had been in preparation under the supervision of Mrs. Calloway, who believed that readiness was a moral quality, and lateness a personal failing, and who had spent 31 years ensuring that neither applied to any room she governed. The house was expecting guests, not the quiet, manageable kind that arrived with modest luggage and left before they became inconvenient, but the ambitious, well-connected, socially calculating kind that arrived with an entourage and expectations and the unspoken assumption that every surface, every servant, and every silence in the house existed for their comfort. Lord Pemberton was bringing his circle down from London for a week of shooting and dining and the sort of leisured conversation that required more effort to sustain than anyone involved would ever admit. The Duke of Ashworth had agreed to host because Lord Pemberton had connections to the Admiralty that were useful, and because refusing would have required an explanation he did not wish to give, and because his late wife had always handled these occasions with the effortless warmth that made difficult people feel welcome without making them feel important, and he had not yet learned how to do it without her. She had been dead 14 months. The house still moved around the shape of her absence, the way water moves around a stone it cannot shift. The staff knew it. The county knew it. The Duke himself knew it in the particular way of a man who has accepted a fact without accepting its consequences, and who continues to operate as though competence is an adequate substitute for the thing that is missing. His son, Caius, was 4. He had his mother's coloring and his father's stillness, and he moved through the large rooms of Ashworth Hall with the cautious attention of a child who understood, in the way children understand things they cannot name, that the house was different now, and that the difference had something to do with him, though no one had explained how. He had a nurse, Mrs. Draper, who was kind and reliable, and who managed his days with the steady routine that was, everyone agreed, what a child in his situation required. He also had, since June, a housemaid named Serath Leonard, who had been hired to replace a girl who had left to marry a farmer in the next county, and who had, in the 3 months since her arrival, become the person in the household that Caius sought when the routine was not enough. This was not her role. She understood that clearly. She was 23, the daughter of a schoolmaster from Hartford, who had educated her beyond her station because he believed education was not a thing that had stations, and who had died when she was 19, leaving her with excellent handwriting, a working knowledge of Latin and natural philosophy, and no money whatsoever. She had gone into service because the alternatives were governess, which required connections she did not have, or marriage, which required a willingness to be managed that she had never been able to manufacture. Service was honest. Service was structured. Service allowed her to be competent in a house full of people who valued competence, and to be invisible in a way that suited her most of the time. But Caius had found her. Children did that. They identified the person in a room who was actually paying attention, and they attached themselves with the unerring accuracy of people who had not yet learned to be indirect about what they needed. She had been polishing the banister on the second-floor landing in her first week when he had appeared at the top of the stairs with a book he could not read and an expression that was asking a question he did not have the words for. She had read him 3 pages of it, a natural history of British birds, before Mrs. Draper had found them and collected him with the polite firmness of a nurse who understood boundaries. The boundaries had held, mostly. Serath was careful about them. She did not seek the boy out. She did not presume. But she was in the house, and he was in the house, and houses have corridors and kitchens and gardens where people cross paths, and she had learned his schedule the way she had learned the schedule of every room she was responsible for. And when their paths crossed, she gave him her attention, completely and without performance, because she understood something about him that she suspected very few people in the household had articulated. He was not a boy who needed routine. He was a boy who needed someone to see him, not manage him, not schedule him, not protect him from the large, quiet fact of his mother's absence by filling every hour with activity. He needed someone to sit with him in the space where the absence lived and not be frightened by it. She had not told anyone this. It was not her place to have opinions about the Duke's son. It was not her place to have opinions about grief or childhood or the particular quality of attention a 4-year-old required from the adults around him. She was a housemaid. Her place was the linen cupboard and the second-floor landing and the drawing room before breakfast. She knew her place. She also knew the boy. The guests arrived on Friday afternoon. 3 carriages, 8 people, and the particular energy that London visitors brought to country houses, the energy of people who were performing relaxation and finding it more tiring than work. Lord Pemberton was first through the door, a man of 52 with the expansive manner of someone who believed every room he entered had been waiting for him. His wife, Lady Pemberton, followed with the composed smile of someone who had spent 26 years translating her husband's expansiveness into something socially navigable. Behind them came the rest of the party, cousins and connections, and a man named Hadley Croft, who had been introduced to Sarath by name only when Mrs. Calloway had briefed the staff on Thursday evening. Mr. Croft, Mrs. Calloway had said, with the careful neutrality she used when she had opinions she was not sharing, is Lord Pemberton's nephew. He is 29. He has a reputation for being entertaining. She had paused. He also has a reputation for being careless. The staff would do well to be attentive. Sarath had noted the word. Careless. It was a word that covered a great deal in a housekeeper's vocabulary. It could mean clumsy with property. It could mean familiar with servants. It could mean the kind of guest who treated a country house as a stage for his own amusement and did not concern himself with what happened to the scenery afterward. She had encountered the type before in the 2 houses she had served in prior to Ashworth. Young men of means who believed that charm was a currency that purchased unlimited tolerance, and who discovered, occasionally and without lasting consequence, that it did not. Hadley Croft arrived with the particular confidence of a man told he was charming so many times that he had confused it with a permanent condition. He was tall, fair-haired, well-dressed in the London manner that signaled awareness of fashion without submission to it, and he entered Ashworth Hall with the assessing gaze of a man who was calculating the entertainment value of everything in the room, including the people. Sarath was carrying fresh linens to the guest wing when she first encountered him directly. He was standing in the corridor outside the room that had been prepared for him, examining a painting on the wall with the performative interest of a man who wanted to be seen examining a painting. He turned when she approached. She kept her gaze forward and her pace steady, because this was the protocol, and because she had been managing corridors since her first position at 16. "You," he said. She stopped. It was not optional. A guest had addressed her. "Yes, sir." His eyes settled on her with the quality of attention she had been warned about, the one that assessed and categorized and did not distinguish between a person and a feature of the house. "This room," he said. "The fire has not been lit. I shall see to it directly, sir." His gaze stayed on her a moment longer than the interaction required. "What is your name?" "Sarath, sir." "An unusual name." "It is my name, sir." She said it without inflection, without challenge, without anything that could be reported as impertinence. She said it the way she said everything to guests, with the precise calibration of someone who understood that the space between respect and submission was narrow, and that she was required to occupy it without appearing to notice it existed. He smiled. It was not an unkind smile. It was worse than that. It was the smile of a man who had found something he considered interesting, and who did not understand. That interesting, in his vocabulary, meant available for his use. She lit his fire. She left. She said nothing to anyone about it, because there was nothing to say. A guest had asked her name. That was ordinary. That was the house. That was service. The first evening passed with the managed elegance that Ashworth Hall could still produce when the occasion required it. The Duke hosted dinner for 12 with the formal precision of a man who understood every requirement of the role and met each one without visible effort and without visible pleasure. Sarah observed this from the edges of the room because she was serving that evening, Mrs. Calloway having assigned her to the dining room for the duration of the visit on the grounds that she was presentable, steady, and unlikely to drop anything. She watched the Duke at the head of the table, managing Lord Pemberton's expansiveness and Lady Pemberton's careful social navigation and the various conversations that multiplied and crossed and required a host's attention to keep from becoming either too interesting or too dull. She watched Hadley Croft at the far end, being entertaining with the practiced ease of a man who knew his value at a dinner table and who was performing it with the fluency of long habit. She watched, and she served, and she was invisible, which was correct, and she thought about the boy upstairs in the nursery, asleep in the room above the dining room, separated from all of this managed adult performance by one floor and an entire world of things he did not yet understand. Saturday morning, the shooting party assembled after breakfast with the particular energy of men eager to hold guns, and the less particular energy of men told they were expected to enjoy holding guns and complying with reasonable enthusiasm. The Duke led them out. The house emptied of its male guests, with the efficient departure of people who had somewhere specific to be, and the house settled into the different rhythm of a morning without them, the rhythm that belonged to the women and the staff and the child. Sarah was in the upstairs corridor when she heard chaos, not crying, not calling, the small, specific sound of a boy talking to himself in the way children did when they were working something out that they did not have an audience for. She paused outside the nursery door, which was ajar. Mrs. Draper was not in the room. She could hear Mrs. Draper's voice downstairs, in conversation with Lady Pemberton's maid, about something involving the laundry schedule. The boy was alone. She looked through the door. He was sitting on the floor by the window, with the book of British birds open on his lap, turning pages he could not read, looking at the illustrations with the focused attention she recognized. He looked up. He saw her. And his face did the thing it did when he saw her, the thing that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, but was the expression of a child who had identified the person who was paying attention and was glad. She should have continued down the corridor. Mrs. Draper would return shortly. The boy was safe. He was not in distress. There was no reason for her to enter the nursery, no professional justification, no emergency that required her presence. She was a housemaid. The nursery was not her domain. She went in. She sat on the floor beside him, arranging her skirts with the automatic neatness of long habit, and he turned to the page with the kingfisher and pointed at it with the deliberate finger of a child who had a question and had found his preferred method of asking it. She told him what it was. She told him where it lived, near rivers and streams. In burrows it dug into the bank with its beak. She told him that the blue was not paint, but the way light moved through the structure of the feather itself, which was something her father had taught her when she was not much older than Caius, sitting at the kitchen table in the schoolhouse in Hartford, with a book not unlike this one open between them, and which she had carried with her since, the way you carry the things that someone who loved you took the time to explain. He listened with the complete attention of someone being spoken to rather than managed. He turned to the next page. A wren. She told him about the wren. He turned again. A barn owl. She told him about the barn owl, and about how it hunted by sound rather than sight, and he looked at her with the focused attention of someone receiving information he considered genuinely important, which it was, because all information given with honesty to a young mind that is listening is important, regardless of whether it concerns barn owls or the nature of the world they are being asked to inhabit. They sat together for 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. 11 minutes of a morning that belonged to the house and not to her, given to a boy who was not her responsibility, in a room that was not her domain, doing something that could not be explained to Mrs. Calloway or justified to anyone who asked. She was not his mother. She was not his nurse. She was not anyone who had a claim on his time or a right to his trust. She was a housemaid who had sat on a nursery floor and talked about birds because a boy had looked at her and she had understood what the look meant. "Miss Us," Draper returned. Sarath stood, smoothed her apron, and left with the composed efficiency of someone who understood that she had just crossed a line, and that the line was real, and that she would cross it again, because some lines were drawn by people who had never sat on a floor with a child who needed them, and she was no longer certain those people had drawn them in the right place. The incident that changed everything happened on Sunday afternoon, and it happened in the garden, and it happened because Hadley Croft had been drinking since lunch and had decided that the grounds of Ashworth Hall were his personal theater, and that everyone in them was either audience or cast. The shooting party had returned early. Rain had come in from the west with the sudden conviction of English weather in September, and the men had been driven back to the house with wet coats and the restless energy of people whose planned entertainment had been canceled and who had not yet found a replacement. Most of them settled in the billiard room. Lord Pemberton settled in the library with a brandy and the satisfaction of a man who preferred conversation to shooting and was pleased to have the excuse. Hadley Croft settled nowhere. He moved through the house with the particular energy of a man who was bored and considered boredom a condition the world was obligated to remedy. Sarath was aware of him. She had tracked him since Friday evening in the way that a person who has been trained to read rooms becomes aware of the element in the room that does not behave predictably. She had served breakfast that morning and had felt his attention twice, once when she poured his coffee, once when she cleared his plate, and both times the attention had the quality she had identified on the first evening, the quality that did not distinguish between a person and a thing he found amusing. She had managed it the way she managed everything, with precision and without acknowledgement. The rain stopped at 3:30. The garden, washed and bright in the September afternoon, drew people out of the house with the gravitational pull of fresh air after confinement. Lady Pemberton walked the formal beds with her cousin. Two of the gentlemen took the south path toward the lake. Mrs. Draper brought Caius outside because the boy had been indoors since Friday and needed the air, and because the garden after rain was the kind of sensory experience that was good for children, and because Mrs. Draper, despite her commitment to routine, was not immune to a beautiful afternoon. Sarath was not in the garden. She was in the upstairs corridor, changing the linens in the blue guest room, which was her task, which was her domain, which was exactly where she was supposed to be. She heard the boy through the open window. Not distress. Laughter. The particular laughter of a 4-year-old who has found a puddle and is exploring the full range of its possibilities. She looked out the window. Caius was in the lower garden, near the stone steps that led down to the ornamental pond. Mrs. Draper was 20 yards behind him on the upper terrace, in conversation with Lady Pemberton's maid, her attention divided between the boy and the social obligation of the conversation in the way that attention divides when you have been doing something for long enough that you believe you can do it at half capacity. The boy was fine. He was playing. He was safe. And then Hadley Croft came around the corner of the yew hedge with a shotgun. He was not aiming it. That was established afterward, by everyone who saw it, with the urgent emphasis of people who understood that the distinction mattered and were not entirely certain it was sufficient. He was carrying it broken over his arm in the manner of a man returning from shooting, except the shooting party had returned 2 hours ago, and the gun room was on the opposite side of the house, and there was no reason for a guest to be walking through the lower garden with a firearm unless the guest had decided to go out alone after the rain, which was precisely what Hadley Croft had done, because he was bored, and because he had been drinking, and because he was the kind of man who believed that rules about gun safety were suggestions addressed to people less competent than himself. He saw the boy. He smiled. He swung the gun up to his shoulder in the casual manner of a man demonstrating something to a child, pointing it toward the tree line beyond the pond, and said something that was later reported variously as, "Watch this," or "Look here," or "Shall I show you something?" And the boy, who was 4 and who did not understand what a shotgun was, or what it meant when a man who had been drinking pointed one in a direction that was 15 degrees from where he was standing, looked up with the open curiosity of a boy who had been offered something interesting by an adult. Sarah was out of the room before she had decided to leave it. The corridor was a blur. The stairs were nothing. She remembered the garden door and the gravel path and the distance between herself and the lower terrace, which was 40 yards, and which she covered at a pace that wasn't running, because running would have been noise, and noise would have been unpredictable, and unpredictable was the one thing she could not afford to be near a man with a gun and a child. She reached Caius. She put herself between the boy and Hadley Croft with the deliberate placement of a person who understood exactly what she was doing and had calculated the geometry of it in the time it took to cross the garden. She never touched the gun. She never raised her voice. She knelt in front of Caius so that her body was between him and the barrel, and she looked up at Hadley Croft, and she said, in a voice that was steady and quiet and carried no more weight than was necessary, "Sir, the gun, please." His gaze found hers. The smile was still on his face. It had not yet caught up with what was happening. It was still the smile of a man being entertaining, and had not yet become the smile of a man being confronted. And in the space between those two expressions, Sarah saw everything she needed to know about him, which was that he was not malicious, but that he was worse than malicious. He was negligent. And negligence near a child was the one thing she had no protocol for tolerating. "Sir," she said again, "please lower the gun. There is a child here." He lowered it. He did it with the slightly confused expression of a man interrupted in a performance and was not sure whether to be offended or amused. He chose amused, which was his default, which was always his default. "My dear girl," he said, "the gun is not loaded. I was merely showing the boy." "The gun is near the boy," she said. "Whether it is loaded is not the question I am asking." His eyes narrowed. The amusement held, but beneath it something shifted. The faint recognition of a man who had encountered an obstacle he had not expected and was deciding whether to go around it or through it. He chose around it because he was in someone else's garden, and because there were other people within sight, and because the girl was kneeling in front of the child in a way that made going through it look like exactly what it would have been. He broke the gun over his arm again and walked away toward the house without looking back, and the garden resumed its Sunday afternoon around them as though nothing had happened, and Mrs. Draper arrived 40 seconds later with the breathless attention of a nurse who had seen the last 10 seconds and was reconstructing the previous 30 from the expression on Sarath's face. Sarath stood. She lifted Caius onto her hip, which was not something a housemaid did with the master's son, and she held him there for a moment, and he put his hand on her shoulder with the weight of someone who has decided where he belongs, and she carried him up the stone steps to the upper terrace and handed him to Mrs. Draper with the steady hands of a person who was going to shake later, when she was alone, and not before. She went back inside. She returned to the blue guest room. She finished the linens. She moved through the remainder of the afternoon with the mechanical precision of someone operating on discipline rather than composure, because the composure was a surface, and beneath it her hands wanted to shake, and her breath wanted to come in the ragged pattern of someone who has been terrified and is only now in the safety of an empty room with fresh sheets and the smell of lavender water, allowing herself to know it. She folded the linens with steady hands. She would not give the shaking permission until she was alone in her room that night, with the door closed and no one to account to, and then she would give it 5 minutes, and then she would stop, because 5 minutes was what she could afford. The afternoon continued. The house continued. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that it was not, because 3 people had seen what had happened in the lower garden, and one of them was the Duke's steward, Mr. Ferris, who had been on the south path returning from the lake, and who had seen all of it, from the gun to the girl to the kneeling to the words, and who said nothing to anyone for the remainder of the afternoon. The kitchen knew by supper. This was the way of households. Information moved through the servants' corridors with a velocity that had nothing to do with gossip, and everything to do with the survival instinct of people who needed to know the state of the house at all times, because the house was where they lived and worked and existed, and a disruption to its order was a disruption to theirs. Mrs. Calloway heard it from Mrs. Draper, who told it with the guilty urgency of a nurse who knew that her attention had been elsewhere, and that elsewhere had nearly been catastrophic. Mrs. Calloway heard it and said nothing, and went about the evening preparations with the focused silence of someone making calculations she did not share. The staff looked at Sarath differently at supper that evening, not with admiration, which would have been simple, not with judgment, which would have been manageable, with the complicated attention of people who understood that she had done something that was simultaneously heroic and presumptuous, and who were waiting to see which interpretation the house would settle on, because in a household like Ashworth, the interpretation that mattered was not the servants, but the masters. Mr. Ferris went to the Duke's study at 7 o'clock that evening and told him everything. He told it the way he told all things, plainly and without embellishment, because he had worked for the Duke for 9 years and understood that the Duke preferred facts to narratives and would construct his own conclusions. The incident in the garden, the drinking, the boy near the ornamental pond, and the housemaid, who had come from nowhere and put herself between them with a quietness that was more alarming than a scream would have been, because it meant she had been thinking clearly the entire time. The Duke listened. He listened the way he listened to all information that concerned his son, which was with the complete, undivided attention of a man for whom this particular subject permitted no distraction and no adequate response. He was quiet for a long time after Mr. Ferris finished. His gaze went to the window, then to the evening garden beyond it, the same garden where his son had been standing, and he thought about the things he did not say aloud, which were the things that lived in the space between a father who had already lost one irreplaceable person, and a father who had nearly, through the negligence of a guest he had invited into his own house, lost another. "Which housemaid?" the Duke said. "Sarath Leonard, Your Grace, the one who reads to Caius." The Duke looked at him. Mr. Ferris met his gaze without elaboration, because the statement was factual, and because the fact that the Duke's steward knew that a housemaid read to the Duke's son told its own story about how visible Sarath Leonard had become in this household without anyone having formally acknowledged it. "Send Mr. Croft to me," the Duke said, "and then I will speak with Miss Leonard." The interview with Hadley Croft was brief. It took place in the Duke's study with the door closed, and no one in the household heard what was said. But the quality of the silence that came through the door was the silence of a man being told something by a duke who was not interested in his explanations and was not offering a discussion. Hadley Croft left Ashworth Hall the following morning, a day before the rest of the party, in a carriage that had been arranged with the efficient finality of a departure that was not optional. His face, as he crossed the entrance hall, had the particular blankness of a man given an accounting of himself that he could not contest. Lord Pemberton said nothing about it at breakfast. Lady Pemberton said nothing about it at any point. The subject of Hadley Croft's early departure was absorbed into the careful silence of a house party that understood something had happened and had collectively decided not to discuss it, which was the way these things were handled in houses like Ashworth, and which meant that the thing itself was never examined, only the silence around it. Sareth was summoned to the Duke's study at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, after Croft's carriage had left, and before the rest of the household had settled into the adjusted rhythm of a party reduced by one. She had expected the summons since Sunday evening, expected it with the composed dread of a person who knew that what she had done in the garden was right, and that being right was not the same as being permitted, and that the distance between those two things was the distance between keeping her position and losing it. She knocked. She was told to enter. She entered. The Duke's study was a room she had cleaned but never occupied. She knew its surfaces and its corners, and the way the light fell across the desk in the morning, but she had never stood in it as a person rather than a function, and the difference was considerable. The Duke was standing behind the desk. He was not sitting. She noted this. A man who intended to dismiss a servant sat behind the desk. A man who was standing had not yet decided what he intended, or had decided something other than dismissal, and was arranging the room to accommodate it. He looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly. In 3 months of service, she had been in his presence dozens of times, serving dinner, crossing corridors, attending to rooms he was about to enter or had just left. She was visible to him the way all servants were visible, which was to say, functionally, but not personally. He had never looked at her as a specific individual with a face and a name and a set of decisions that mattered. He was looking at her now. "Miss Leonard," he said. "Your Grace." She stood with her hands folded and her posture correct, and the steady composure of a person who had decided that if she was going to be dismissed, she was going to be dismissed, standing straight, and that the manner of the exit mattered as much as the fact of it. "Mr. Ferris has told me what happened in the garden yesterday," the Duke said. "Yes, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved to the window, then back to her. "You placed yourself between my son and a man with a firearm. It was not loaded, Your Grace." "Mr." Croft stated that it was not. The Duke's gaze shifted. It was not the formal attention of a host. It was not the distant authority of a master addressing a servant. It was something rawer than either of those, something that had to do with a boy upstairs and a wife he had buried, and the particular quality of fear that a parent experiences when they learn, after the fact, that their child was in danger, and they were not there. "You did not know it was not loaded," he said. "No, Your Grace, I did not." "And you went anyway." She held his gaze. It was not defiance. It was not performance. It was the simple, direct attention of a person who had done something and was not going to pretend it had been anything other than what it was. "Yes, Your Grace." "I did." He was quiet again. The study was quiet. The Monday morning moved through the house around them, the sounds of a household resuming its operations, Mrs. Calloway's voice in the corridor, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the ordinary machinery of a life that continued regardless of what happened in the rooms where decisions were made. "Tell me about the reading," he said. She had not expected this. She had expected questions about what she had done in the garden and why. She had not expected the reading. She felt, for the first time since entering the room, the ground shift beneath a conversation she had thought she understood. She said carefully, "I have, on occasion, read to your son, when our paths have crossed in the house, the Book of British Birds. It was not my place to do so, and I understand, if this is a concern." He looked at her. "It is not a concern," he said. "It is information." He paused. "My son does not take to people easily. He has not, since his mother died. He is careful with his attention. He is selective about who receives it." His gaze moved to the desk, then to the books on the shelf behind him. "He is 4 years old, and he has the instincts of a man twice my age about who in a room is actually paying attention and who is performing it." She said nothing. She understood that he was not asking a question. He was arriving at something, and the arriving required him to say it aloud, perhaps for the first time. "Mrs. Draper is excellent," he said. "She is reliable and kind, and she manages his days with the consistency he needs. She is not." He stopped. He looked at the window again. "She is not the person he seeks when the routine is insufficient." He looked back at Sarath. "You are." She held her composure. She held it because it was all she had in this room, and because the alternative was to acknowledge that a duke had just told her something about his son that he had clearly not said to anyone else, and that the saying of it had cost him something she could see in the set of his shoulders and the way his hands rested on the desk, not gripping, but placed with the deliberate control of a man who was managing more than a conversation. "I do not know why he has chosen you," the Duke said, "but he has. And yesterday, in the garden, you justified his judgment in a way that I am not able to dismiss or ignore or fold into the ordinary operations of this household." He was quiet. "You acted as though he mattered to you, not as a duty, not as a function of your position, as though he mattered." "He does," she said. It was 2 words. She had not planned them. They came out with the simplicity of something that was true and did not require elaboration, and they landed in the room with the weight of a thing that changed what the room was for. "Sit down, Miss Leonard," the Duke said. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. She sat because he had asked, and because the asking had changed the room from an interview into something she did not yet have a category for, and she was going to need to sit down to find out what it was. What he told her in the study that Monday morning was this: he was removing her from the housemaid rotation. He was assigning her to Caius, not as a nurse, not as a governess, not as anything that had a title the household would recognize without question, but as a companion to his son, with the specific instruction that she was to read to him, walk with him, answer his questions, and be present in the way that she had already been present, without anyone authorizing it. She sat in the chair and understood 3 things simultaneously. The first was that this was an extraordinary act for a duke. The second was that the household would have opinions about it that would range from approval to suspicion. The third was that he was watching her face while he said it, not for gratitude, but for the thing she had shown him in the garden, the steady, undramatic competence of a person who did what was required, because it was required, and not because she expected it to be noticed. "Your Grace," she said, "I am a housemaid. I am not qualified to educate your son." "You are the daughter of a schoolmaster," he said. She looked at him. He met her gaze with the direct attention she was beginning to understand was not authority, but the absence of pretense. "You taught yourself Latin from your father's library. You know natural philosophy well enough to explain the structure of a kingfisher's feather to a 4-year-old in language he can understand." He paused. "I have had 3 governesses apply for the position since my wife died. Each of them was qualified. None of them was what he needed. He needs someone who is not afraid of the space where his mother was," the Duke said. "Someone who will sit in it, with him, and not try to fill it with activity or routine. He looked back at her. You did that, on the landing, with the book. You sat with him, and you did not try to fix anything. You just read. I will do my best, Your Grace, she said. She said it without performance, plainly, with the full weight of her intention behind it. And the Duke nodded once, and the nod was the end of the conversation, and the beginning of something neither of them had planned. October was the month the household adjusted. Mrs. Calloway handled the transition with neutral efficiency. Mrs. Draper surprised Sarath with something she had not anticipated. Relief. The relief of a good woman who had been doing her best with a child, whose needs exceeded her training, and who recognized that the best thing she could do for the boy was to welcome the person who could reach him. Caius changed. Not dramatically. It was the slow accumulating evidence of a boy who was being seen consistently by someone who understood what seeing meant. He talked more. He asked more questions. He laughed with the unself-conscious frequency of someone who had found an audience for his laughter. He brought her leaves and stones and a beetle he wanted identified, and she identified them all with the patient specificity of her father's teaching. The Duke observed this. He observed it with the careful attention of a man who trusted evidence more than reports, and what the evidence showed him was a son who was waking up. He said at once to the portrait of his wife that hung in the corridor outside the nursery on an evening in late October. She's good with him. It was a man telling a woman who could not hear him that someone else was doing the thing she would have done, and doing it well, and that he was grateful and afraid, and something else he did not have a name for yet. The county dinner in November was where the matter became public. The dinner was at Hollings Park, the Alderton estate, and the full county was present, approximately 40 people who had known each other's business since before they could remember. Lady Pemberton found Sarath's name in conversation the way a river finds a gap in a wall. The Duke's new arrangement, she said to Mrs. Alderton, within hearing of 3 other women. A housemaid, I understand. As companion to the boy. She said housemaid, with the precise inflection of someone who believed the word carried its own argument. One does wonder what qualifications a housemaid brings to the education of a Duke's son. Beyond, she paused. Beyond the domestic. The pause did what she intended it to do. It filled the space around the word domestic with an implication that was not about education at all, but about something she considered more dangerous, and which she was willing to suggest, without stating, because suggestion was more damaging than statement in rooms like this. The Duke was 12 feet away. He heard it completely. He did not interrupt. He finished his sentence about the road levy, and then turned with the unhurried precision of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to say. Miss Leonard, the Duke said, and the room heard him because the room was always listening, is the daughter of Edmund Leonard of Hertford, who was a schoolmaster of considerable reputation. She reads Latin. She understands natural philosophy. She has in 3 months accomplished with my son what 3 qualified governesses could not in the year preceding her arrival. He looked at Lady Pemberton. The qualifications are extensive. The domestic arrangements of my household are not, I think, a matter that requires further speculation. He held her gaze for precisely long enough to communicate that the sentence was not an invitation to respond, and then returned to his conversation as though nothing had occurred. And Lady Pemberton found her wine-glass very interesting for the next several minutes, and the room adjusted itself around the new information with the silent efficiency of a county that had just been told something by a duke and had understood it completely. Sarath heard about it on Wednesday from Mrs. Calloway, who told her what Lady Pemberton had said, and what the Duke had said with careful evenness, and then looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent 31 years in service and had seen exactly 2 occasions on which a duke had publicly defended a servant by name. "This is the second," Mrs. Calloway said. "The first was when he defended his wife against his own mother 11 years ago." She paused. "He does not do this lightly." Sareth stood in the housekeeper's sitting room and thought about a man who had said her father's name, Edmund Leonard of Hartford, which meant he had asked someone about her, which meant he had wanted to know, which meant that the arrangement was not only about Caius, and perhaps had not been only about Caius since the morning in the study when she had said he does and meant it. The walks began in December. The Duke framed it as practical. He wanted to walk the estate with Caius, and he wanted Sareth present because the boy was more comfortable with her, which was true, and which was also not the complete reason, and both of them knew it. They walked the South Fields on the first Tuesday, the three of them, the Duke and Sareth and Caius between them, and the boy held Sareth's hand, because that was his preference, and the Duke pointed at things and named them: the tenant cottages, the winter wheat, the drainage that was his grandfather's engineering and his own neglect, which he admitted with the honesty of a man who understood that the estate had suffered during the long months he had been managing grief instead of land. Sareth told Caius about the winter wheat, how it was planted in autumn and grew through the cold and was harvested in summer, and that the cold was not a punishment but a requirement, because the wheat needed the frost to strengthen its roots, and Caius listened with the seriousness he brought to all botanical information, and the Duke listened with an expression that Mr. Ferris, walking 30 yards behind, would later describe to Mrs. Calloway as the look of a man hearing something he had forgotten was possible. The walks continued through December, Tuesdays and Thursdays, weather permitting. The Duke brought his knowledge of the land and the tenants and the history of Ashworth, going back 5 generations. Sareth brought her father's teaching and the ability to translate the Duke's knowledge into something a 4-year-old could carry. And Caius brought himself, which was increasingly, week by week, more of himself than anyone in the household had seen since before his mother died. And once, on a Thursday in the 3rd week, when Caius had run ahead to investigate a frozen puddle, the Duke said, without looking at her, "He is happy." "Yes," she said. "He is." The Duke was quiet. The December afternoon was cold and still around them. "I had not heard him laugh," the Duke said, "in 11 months. Until October." She said nothing. She understood that the Duke did not require responses to things that cost him something to say. He required only that they were heard. She heard him. She walked beside him in the December cold and thought about a man who had counted the months since his son's last laugh and who had told her the number as though it were weather. And she understood, with the precision she brought to all important information, that the feeling she had been refusing to let become what it was trying to become had become it without her permission, and it was not going to be managed back into its previous category. Christmas brought it closer. Caius wanted Sareth at the morning service, and the Duke placed her in the household pew rather than the servants' gallery without consultation, a decision noted by the entire congregation without comment, which was itself a comment. Caius wanted Sareth to see the gift his father had given him, watercolor paints, which he brought to her in the kitchen on Christmas afternoon with the urgency of a child who needed his important person to see his important thing. On Christmas evening, the Duke found her in the nursery, sitting at the small table with Caius, painting a robin, badly, because watercolor was not among her skills, and the boy was painting something he identified as a kingfisher, but which bore a stronger resemblance to a blue cloud with legs. The Duke stood in the doorway. She had no idea how long he had been there before she looked up. Long enough, she thought, from the expression on his face, which had nothing managed in it and everything exposed, directed at the scene in front of him, the woman and the boy and the watercolors, and the small, ordinary, devastating fact of a boy who was happy on Christmas. She started to stand. "Stay," he said. He crouched beside Caius and looked at the blue cloud with legs and said it was an excellent kingfisher. And Caius said, "Serath told me the blue is not paint. It is light." And the Duke looked at her over his son's head with an expression that was not the gaze of a master looking at a servant. And she held his gaze for one moment longer than service permitted, and then looked at the painting, and the moment passed. And later, alone in her room, she allowed the certainty to be what it was, which was that she was in love with a man she could not have, in a house where she was changing a child's life, and these two facts were going to collide, and she did not know what would remain standing when they did. It was the Duke who named it. February. The study. Late afternoon. Caius asleep upstairs. He sat behind the desk this time. Sitting meant he had arrived at something. He talked about Caius for 10 minutes. The progress was real and significant. Then he stopped talking about Caius. "Miss Leonard," he said, "I must tell you something that I have been attempting to tell you since approximately November." He looked at his hands on the desk, his gaze lifted to hers. "I am aware that the consequences of saying it fall disproportionately on you, and I find that unconscionable, and I find the silence equally unconscionable, and I don't know how to resolve the contradiction except to speak." She knew what he was going to say. She had known since Christmas. She waited, because the knowing was hers, but the saying had to be his. Because in a house where she had no power, and he had all of it, the only honest act was for the person with power to name the thing first. "I'm in love with you," he said. He said it plainly, with the full weight of his intention behind it. And she heard her own words from September in the shape of his, the same directness, the same refusal to make a true thing ornamental. "Your Grace," she said, "you are a duke. I am a housemaid in your employ. What you have said will cost me everything I have built in this house if it goes wrong, and will cost you the opinion of every family in this county if it goes right." "I know," he said. "I am in love with you as well," she said. "I have been since the walks, possibly since the study, certainly since Christmas. I did not want to be. I have been calculating the cost since November, and the calculation has not changed the fact, which tells me it is not a calculation, but a truth. And I do not know what to do with truths that are this inconvenient." He stood. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her chair, and she stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were close in the February study with the failing light and the sleeping child above them, and 6 months of walks and dinners and kingfishers between them. He took her hand the way he did everything, with precise, unhurried intention. She let him take it, and the letting was the first thing she had done in this house that was entirely hers. Not a function of her role or her position, but hers. The act of a woman who had decided that this man, this specific, impossible, grief-worn, honest man, was worth the cost she had been calculating, and that the calculation was complete, and the answer was yes. "William," she said. His name, not his title. She had never used it before. She had not been given permission to use it. She used it now because permission was beside the point when a man had just handed you his heart in a sentence, and the only honest response was to hand back his name, the real one, the one that belonged to him, and not to the estate or the county or the 200 years of Ashworth precedent. He looked at her. "No one calls me that," he said. "I know," she said. "Serath," he said. And her name in his voice was not the name Mrs. Calloway used, or the name on the household ledger. It was the name her father had given her, spoken by a man who understood what it meant to say a name, as though it were the only word that mattered. He kissed her. It was not a duke kissing a housemaid. It was William kissing Serath. It was a man kissing the woman who had knelt in a garden with his child behind her and had said 4 words that changed everything, and who had sat on a nursery floor and talked about the light in a kingfisher's feather, and who had walked beside him through December and January and February without once asking him for anything, and who had been, in every moment since September, the most honest person in his house. She kissed him back with the same steady, undramatic certainty she had brought to the garden and the nursery, and every true thing she had decided since her father died and left her with excellent handwriting and no money, and the unshakable conviction that her own judgment, carefully applied, was the most reliable thing she possessed. The study was quiet. The February evening settled around them. The house continued its operations beyond the closed door, and none of them knew yet, and all of them, Serath suspected, already did. They were married in April. The Duke made the announcement at a dinner at Ashworth in March, standing at the head of his own table with Serath beside him. "Miss Leonard has done me the honor of accepting my proposal." He said nothing else. He did not explain. He did not justify. He did not offer the county the context it wanted, because the woman beside him did not require context. She required only what she had always required, which was to be seen clearly and to be met with honesty. And he had done both. Lady Pemberton listened with the composure of someone outmaneuvered who knew it. She congratulated them with the correct words in the correct order, and Serath received the congratulations with the steady gaze she had carried through every difficult room since her first position in service, and nothing further was required. The wedding was at the village church. Serath wore a dress that was not elaborate and not apologetic, the kind of dress that said exactly what she intended, which was, "I am here, and I am not performing." Caius stood beside his father at the front, because the boy was the reason, and the center, and the proof, and having him there, said everything the county needed to hear about why this was happening. Serath walked to the front on no one's arm, because her father was dead, and a substitute was unthinkable, and because the Duke understood that she would walk to him on her own terms, or not at all. She reached the front. She looked at William. She looked at Caius, who was holding his father's hand, and looking at her with the expression she had first seen on the landing, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, the expression of a child who had found the person who was paying attention and was certain of it now, in a way he had not been certain of anything since before his world had changed. She did not kneel. She had knelt once, in a garden, in front of this boy, with danger behind her, and the absolute clarity of a woman who knew what mattered. That kneeling had been the first true thing. It had said, "I will put myself between you and anything that threatens you, and I do not require permission to do so." She stood. She took William's hand. She took Caius's hand. She stood at the front of the church holding both of them, the man and the boy, the Duke and his son, and the village and the county and the congregation saw it. And what they saw was not a housemaid who had risen above her station, but a woman who had been in her station all along, the one she had chosen in a garden in September, when she had knelt without hesitation and spoken without deference, and done the only thing that mattered, which was the right thing, at the right moment, for the right reason. William looked at her. She looked at him. She thought about September and the garden and, "Sir, the gun, please." She thought about the study and "Sit down, Miss Leonard." She thought about December walks and Christmas watercolors, and a man who had counted 11 months of his son's silence and told her the number with the trust of a man who had decided she was the person to hear it. She thought about her father, who had taught her Latin and the structure of feathers, and the conviction that her own judgment was reliable, and who would have liked this man, because William was the kind who said true things plainly and did not require the world to make them easy. She held their hands. The April morning was warm through the church windows. The service continued. The county of Kent continued around them, arriving, as counties do, at the conclusion it would carry forward, which was that the Duke of Ashworth had married a woman who had knelt in his garden and shielded his son and spoken 4 words that changed everything, and that the words had not been a performance, but the simple, direct expression of a woman who knew what was right and did it, and who had been, from the beginning, exactly where she belonged.